Alfred Street, get ready. January is coming, and do you know what that means? Seminary Saturdays. Every Saturday during the month of January, we will have one of the leading scholars come in to talk to us on the topic of From Christ to Christianity. We are going to have people who are experts in New Testament, early Christianity, the Reformation, the Black Church, all here to give us more information to think about as we develop and learn how to be better Christians. You don't want to miss it. Saturday, 9:30, and a continental breakfast starting at 8:45. Be there or be square. It's gonna be awesome. Alfred Street, get ready. January is coming, and do you know what that means? Seminary Saturdays. Every Saturday during the month of January, we will have one of the leading scholars come in to talk to us on the topic of From Christ to Christianity. We are going to have people who are experts in New Testament, early Christianity, the Reformation, the Black Church, all here to give us more information to think about as we develop and learn how to be better Christians. You don't want to miss it. Saturday, 9:30, and a continental breakfast starting at 8:45. Be there or be square. It's gonna be awesome. Alfred Street, get ready. January is coming, and do you know what that means? Seminary Saturdays. Every Saturday during the month of January, we will have one of the leading scholars come in to talk to us on the topic of From Christ to Christianity. We are going to have people who are experts in New Testament, early Christianity, the Reformation, the Black Church, all here to give us more information to think about as we develop and learn how to be better Christians. You don't want to miss it. Saturday, 9:30, and a continental breakfast starting at 8:45. Be there or be square. It's gonna be awesome.
So we're in week 2 now, and I think it's been really good for us as a family. So far, we're all kind of getting on board, and I just thought it would be really, really nice if I wrote a letter to all of my online retailers. So of course, my Amazon letter had to be first, and I know David will love it.
Jade, are you seriously writing a letter to Amazon?
Hi, honey. I did. I just wanted them to know where I've been and to not miss me. So do you want to hear it?
Please.
Dear Amazon, I know you're wondering where I've been. It's me, not you. My church is participating in Seek. Have you heard of it? Call Pastor Wesley if you have any questions. I'm sure he'll love that. But rest assured, I haven't forgotten about you, and I will be back in 32 days. Love, Jade, your #1 customer. Didn't you like the letter, though?
I thought it was a bit dramatic. Anytime you write a letter to the founder of Amazon to let them know that you'll be back, it's giving delusion. Delulu. I mean, wow, with a letter like this, it would be impossible to forget about you.
I just want to communicate, since we are doing this fast and that they haven't seen me for 2 weeks. So I'm taking time now, after the letter, to create some homemade gifts and crafts, and hopefully Charlie can participate as well, since we can't do any online purchasing.
Can we have one more day of Seek?
No, we're gonna have to do the remaining 32 days. However, we can do some crafts. Do you wanna help?
No, I don't. How long is Seek? It's already been a week. That kind of hurt my neck a bit.
And I'm gonna need a few more materials.
A coffee filter?
It's gonna work. You just gotta pray about it. Some paint, the broom, and It's gonna come together, I believe. Are you gonna join us with the craft?
I'm gonna go get all the materials.
It'd be a nice family event, crafting together.
Yes.
Lord help me as we come up with these ideas.
Welcome to our final installment of Seminary Saturdays. This is one of my favorite things about Alfred Street because we have a pastor who wants us to use our minds, who wants us to be critical thinkers, and we are better equipped to be critical thinkers when we have more information. So this year for 2025, our theme has been From Christ to Christianity. tracing this movement. How did this thing, these small group of people following in the way, end up like this? And we weren't able to do it all because there were only 4 sessions, and that's a lot of time. But we were able to look at how Paul's writing shaped and influenced the church, the political movement that took us up to Constantine when Christianity became the national religion. We spent some time thinking about the Reformation, which is why we are Baptists. It has a lot to do with that tradition. And today I'm delighted that we get to hear from Dr. Barbara Savage, who's going to talk to us about the African American church. And the African American church is such an important part of church history. I hope we recognize the important role we play in the Christian faith. And that's going to matter more today, more than ever before. So it's important that we know who we are and why we are. Amen? All right, so what we want to do is I'm going to offer up a word of prayer, and then I'm going to, I want to remind you that a question is a question, right? I know we all have a lot of words. We're an oral culture. However, for this time, to allow everyone to get an opportunity to ask a question, please bring your question, and we're going to ask for one at a time. If you have 2, then you got to wait for the next round. Amen? All right, don't make me get up there and say no. I will, but please don't make me. All right? Let's say a word of prayer. God, we are so grateful for the gift of this day and that we're here to see it. Lord, on this morning, with our gratitude, we want to thank you for your faithfulness. Even when we find ourselves in a world that we struggle to understand, we do trust and believe that you are God, and we are relying on your faithfulness. We thank you for this congregation, for this church, and for our pastor. And we thank you today, God, for our guest speaker who will come and share with us. Be in our midst. Open up our eyes and our ears and our hearts so that we can see and hear and be transformed. Amen. All right, I'm going to invite you to stand up and greet at least 4 people, preferably somebody you don't know, and then we'll have our introductory video.
Judy, Agnes is one of my old
Saints, we're going to watch the introductory video, and then we will welcome with applause our guest speaker, Dr. Barbara Savage.
Seminary Saturday Bible Study Series, From Christ to Christianity. This morning, we are honored to have Dr. Barbara Savage share her profound insights on the Black church. Dr. Savage brings with her a wealth of experience. For over 2 decades at the University of Pennsylvania, she taught graduate and undergraduate courses in 20th century African American history, American religious and social reform movements, the history of the relationship between media and politics, and Black women's political and intellectual history. She is the Geraldine R. Siegel Professor Emerita of American Social Thought in the Department of Africana Studies, where she also served as inaugural chair. She was the Vivian Harmsworth Visiting Professor of American History at the University of Oxford and remains a distinguished fellow at the Rothmere American Institute at Oxford, where a thesis prize in Black history is named in her honor. She is the author of 3 thought-provoking books. Mers Tate, The Global Odyssey of a Black Woman Scholar, garnered her 2 awards: Best Book in African American History from the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, and the Darlene Clark Hine Award. Her book, Your Spirits Walk Beside Us, The Politics of Black Religion, was the winner of the prestigious 2012 Grawemeyer Prize in Religion and Broadcasting Freedom, Radio, War, and the Politics of Race, 1938 to 1948, won the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library Award for the Best Book in American History in the period of 1916 to 1966. Dr. Savage received her doctorate in history from Yale, a law degree from Georgetown University, and an undergraduate degree from the University of Virginia. Alfred Street, please give Dr. Barbara Savage a warm welcome.
Thank you. Oh, this is the day the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. And that is the spirit that I have felt in all of my interactions with this church from the moment that Pastor Judy reached out to me. And certainly I have some sense of this church and its mission and its presence and your extraordinary leadership here, including your pastor. I found out I was going to be at Albert Street from a lot of people who actually told me I was going to be here because your online presence is all over the country. I had an usher in my church in Philadelphia whisper it to me. She said, "Oh, I see you're going to be at Albert Street." So I said, "How do you know?" And then I went and looked, and I could see even better the power of what you're doing here in this sanctuary and in the world and in the community. So it is an absolute honor to be here. And I'm going to move this up just a little bit so my bifocals can see what I have written on these little pieces of paper. And I'm just grateful, as I said, to Pastor and to Judy, and certainly to your security officers, Tony and Joe, who picked me up, and we had lively conversations in the car about football. If you say you are in Philadelphia and you come here this weekend, you're going to talk about football. But peace be with you on that. So I want to start by saying that, first of all, I'm not a preacher, and you will see that soon, although I've heard a lot of preaching because I was a daughter of a choir member for 60 or 70 years of her life. Not a theologian, not a biblical scholar, but I am a historian of 20th century African American history and religion, and so I come to you from that. And what I plan to do is we're going to break this into 2 parts as I was instructed. I will say what I'm going to say and then give you an opportunity, looking forward to exchanging ideas and Q&A discussion with you. We'll take a break, what the British call a comfort break, which I think is a lovely term, and then we'll come back and go into part 2. And in part 1, I plan to talk about, I think one of the things that I have become interested in the last few years is the relationship between biography and history, between, what does it mean when we start to look at the individual lives of Black people, wherever they are, and what is it that those lives can still teach us, and what can we learn for ourselves, especially right now, to help us weather this period that we're in. And I hope that you will hear the words of the people I'll be talking about as the words of faithful witnesses speaking to us still in terms of struggle and I think in times that were even harder than the one that we're facing today. So in part one, I'm going to talk about a talk called Nanny, Helen, Burroughs and the Advent to the Civil Rights Movement. And when we come back for part two, I'm going to talk about the Civil Rights Movement itself. Again, through the lives of three people that I consider religious rebels, and those are Fannie Lou Hamer, John Lewis, and Marion Wright Edelman. So that's what we're going to do. All right, so I've written about the history of African American religion, and I want to take us back actually to the early period before I get to the 20th century, which is where I live and breathe in terms of what I know best. But I will just want to start by reminding us that throughout the 20th century, there were all of these debates among lots of groups of African Americans about whether religious doctrines, religious people, and religious organizations were a blessing or a curse in the struggle for Black freedom and racial progress. And that's an ongoing debate, frankly. And so churches, although they were continually called upon to be savior institutions, historically they were most often criticized for failing in that mission. In fact, in the first half of the 20th century, the dominant political narratives treated African American religion with despair and disdain. The emergence in the 1950s of the civil rights movement with churches and church people and church culture at its center was a powerful and startling departure from that story. It was the movement itself that changed our notions and expectations about the relationship between African American religion and politics. I want to chart some of the episodes in the early history of our religious history and the struggle for a larger, more focused role for the church as it played out in the lives of individual Black religious people. And I'm going to do that first by going back for just a little bit to the 18th century, to the 1700s. So I want to start by saying that Black protest against slavery and against racial injustices was cast as much of 18th century discourse, much of 18th century language, in explicitly religious terms. The Bible was the framing document of the discourse at that time. But as early as 1774, Africans in Massachusetts petitioned for release from their condition as slaves for life in a Christian land. In both the North and the South, Christian hypocrisy became a repeated refrain in the fight to abolish slavery, a line of argument made more urgently by the spread of evangelical Christianity during the late 18th century, the late 1700s, which undercut social hierarchy and racial difference among its followers, both Black and white. Yet by the turn of the 19th century, when we get to the 1800s, the power of Southern white Christians had forced a retreat. White Methodists and Baptists dampened their opposition to slavery, acting out racial discrimination within their own denominations and sanctuaries. Free Blacks in the North established their own churches, beginning with two groups in Philadelphia in the 1790s. One left they both left the same white church. One left that church to found an independent Black Methodist tradition, the Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church, which is the founding church of the AME denomination, while the other, the African Episcopal Church of St. Thomas, chose to remain within the larger Episcopal denomination. And I should say, in fairness, that I actually am a member of that church. So every Sunday I walk into church, there's a big banner outside that says established in 1792, and that makes me feel really good that it's still there and that we are in there trying to still bear witness to that. And it also, I should say about the Episcopal denomination, it's also one of the reasons I felt such pride when Bishop Buddy across the way spoke her truth the other day, because even though we are predominantly a Black congregation, we're also a Black congregation that's full of LGBTQ people, but it's also full of immigrants, because there are people in the pews who come from Liberia and Kenya and Ghana who come from all over the Caribbean, who come from South America, and who are in the Anglican communion, and we come into that place in what I see as one of the most diverse gatherings of Black people that I know, and so I was very proud to have that denomination, someone with that leadership, speak in that place in that way, and so we must continue to support and pray for her and for her safety. Those two decisions, that is that these churches, St. Thomas and Mother Bethel, came out of that same St. George's Church in Philadelphia, and we once a year have a combined service with St. George's as a way of continuing to reconcile and acknowledge that history, even as we all have gone our particular ways in it. But I just want to use those two examples to say that that's also an early indicator of the historical diversity that exists among Black churches. It also indicates this kind of ambivalent relationship to white American Christianity that Black people have, but also it has the effect of reminding us of the innately political nature of African American religion and churches. We made that move because we were treated wrongly, because the churches we were in did not recognize us as fully human. That's a political act that I see in those decisions of those early folks. And both of those churches continued to do their work in the 1700s and the early 1800s in something called the Free Africa Society in Philadelphia, which was an organization that was dedicated not only to racial solidarity, but especially to the abolition of slavery for our brothers and sisters who were in fact still enslaved below the Mason-Dixon line. Now in the South, enslaved people held a variety of religious beliefs, but were often forced to share segregated worship experiences under the surveillance of white Baptists and Methodists. Simultaneously, many of them forged a separate and largely invisible set of beliefs and practices. Some of those were Christian beliefs, some of them were Islam-inflected, and some derived from African belief systems. And sometimes they just mixed all of that up together. Held in common, however, was the belief that slavery was a moral wrong and that retribution would ensue, an interpretation borne out with the coming of the Civil War and emancipation. So abolitionist claims, whether advanced by Blacks or their white allies, were grounded in religious arguments. Now, during Reconstruction, Black communities were able in the South to establish their own churches more freely, primarily Baptists throughout the South. Many of those who emerged as Black political leaders in that period were ministers empowered by their literacy, as so few other Black people knew how to read or write since it had been illegal under slavery. But also those preachers played a prominent role in building the churches and also serving in state legislatures during the Reconstruction period. Despite everything that people were trying to do, that was the period, as we know, was continued to be marked by racial violence and the denial of Black equality. In fact, it got worse after the federal occupation of the South was lifted in 1877. And so that little brief period of being free or imagining what it meant to be free in electoral politics ended with the end of Reconstruction. So it's no wonder that by the time we get to the 19th century, of the 1800s drew to a close, questions had already emerged about the relationship between Black religion and the prospects for Black political advancement. So when those arguments move into the 20th century, and that's where I spend the bulk of my time, writing and researching, most African Americans, and we need to be reminded of this, were but a few generations removed from slavery. Oral history and memoirs from that time show that many of them had family memories and stories reaching back to their enslaved ancestors. Many rural Black Southerners had forged a chain of memory to that history, which they consecrated through song and ritual, they continued to rely upon that for daily inspiration, and they passed that on to their children. Ideas about the powerful and sometimes, I think, romanticized connection between religion, history, and memory remained in place decades later. And I want to give us an illustration of that with a poem that was written in 1944 by a young black poet named Robert Hayden. He would go on actually to end up being a poet laureate at the Library of Congress many years later. Here's that poem. We have not forgotten the prayers you prayed, black fathers, oh black mothers, kneeling in the cabin gloom, debased, yet in your hearts bearing high springtime pageantries of faith. We have not forgotten your morning hope, more burning than the sun of cotton fields, upon dark shackled limbs, nor songs your anguish suckled. And then Hayden makes a move, and he links the power of that faithfulness and hope in slavery to the continuing struggle to realize the possibilities of American democracy. And he concludes this way: and if we keep our love for the American earth, black fathers, oh black mothers, believing that its fields will bear for us at length a harvesting of sun, it is because your spirits walk beside us as we plow. It is because the land has grown from your great deathless hearts. So freedom had brought an end to slavery, but by the early 20th century, it had yet to yield an emancipation from gross inequality, from cruelties, from violence, from exploitation. So this need for liberation continues, as did the search for material and spiritual tools with which to achieve that. So Hayden's expression of his indebtedness to religious faith and the struggle of enslaved people, I think, really captures that for us again in the 1940s. That was also a period when these discussions about black religion were marked by a profound unease with the legacy of spiritual practice of enslaved people, a cultural heritage that many viewed as antiquated, as primitive, tainted by sins of slavery, by the sin of slavery, and marked by pagan retentions from Africa. Some thought of black Christianity as a slave religion, and that was not a good thing. Thought of black Christianity as a slave religion that had run its course and lost its political and spiritual potency to meet the new demands of a more modern struggle against racial oppression. So although most African Americans remained in the South, the many thousands who were steadily migrating to cities in the North, including Washington and others, brought with them a religious heritage that was quite distinct from that found in many established urban black communities, especially in northern cities. Migration and urbanization did little, of course, to ease the persistent poverty that was made worse by depression and discrimination, segregation, and legal incapacity. And in fact, the end of World War I, which was supposed to be a war fought for everybody's freedom, just was marked by a resurgence of violence against black people and black men, even some in their military uniforms, and the heightening of Jim Crow practices, and not just in the South. So I say all this to remind us that public expressions of both hope and anxiety about the role of black religious institutions in alleviating these conditions, these were not merely academic or rhetorical exercises, because there was too much at stake. People were suffering. These debates were part of a search for ways to reshape rural and urban communities into effective political collectives for black people. Churches were seen as central to both of those projects because they were the only indigenous black-controlled organizations with the potential for mass mobilization. Now, some people saw that as a good thing and some as a bad thing, but it was accepted as a reality. So the first half of the 20th century is also marked by increasing religious diversity among black people, among African Americans. There's exponential growth in the numbers of Baptist and Methodist churches, but then there also continued to be the practice of clearly identifiable African-derived religions in the urban North and the rural South. Marcus Garvey's attack on white Christian hypocrisy itself a persistent strand in Black political thought, was coupled with his embrace of a Black God and a Black Jesus. And in some places, people have written about Marcus Garvey's movement in religious terms for that reason. At the same time, storefront churches established by Pentecostal and holiness believers continued to reshape the religious landscape of Black communities, as did the emergence in the 1930s of smaller groups led by Father Divine, a Daddy Grace, and perhaps most significantly, Elijah Muhammad. So we see all this sort of shifting going on in the 20th century of demographics, of theological ideas, but all of this is still made more urgent by the need to find some way of creating political unity across Black people, even though we have become a much more religiously diverse minority by that time. And so for all of those reasons, this relationship between Black religion and Black political activism grew even more vexed, even more contentious, even more argumentative. And it was a moment where religion was seen as full of promise, but it was also, I think, damned by exalted expectations. There was only so much that churches could do at that time. So I want to just now kind of move a little bit and to just say that one of the things that is persistent is that if you're going to call Black churches into public duty, into assuming a role that's beyond the sanctuary, that's beyond taking care of the spiritual needs of people who are here in these pews, and if you're seeing the church as a primary vehicle for doing that, then that means that your view of empowering the race relies on an institution that was and remains largely male-led but female-dominated, not only in memberships, but in fundraising and organizing activities. So while the predominance of women is a feature of most Christian religious systems, there are specific political consequences in this case because of the centrality of religious institutions, because of the importance of the church in Black community and Black political life. This reality aggravates persisting sensitivities about the strength and substantiality of Black women and about Black male authority and masculinity. But because the typical Black church member was a working-class Black woman, debates about the role that Black religious institutions should or should not play in Black politics was also implicitly, but rarely explicitly, an argument about the place of Black women in American political life and about the unstated problem of their largely absent male counterparts. And that tension rests with us still today, and not just in Black churches. So I want to talk now and try to enliven this some. Thank you for sitting through the history lesson. We'll talk now about Nanny Helen Burroughs, who I think embodies so many of these ideas in such vivid and powerful ways. For those of you who may not know about Burroughs, she was a Black woman who was born in 1879 in Virginia. She was actually born in central Virginia between sort of Washington and Charlottesville. Her parents had been enslaved. But until her death in 1961, so she lived a long life, 1879 to 1961, Burroughs concentrated her life's work with a laser-like focus on Black Baptist women, especially the masses of Black working-class women who, like her, devoted their time, their talents, and their treasures to the churches they called home. When she was a young child, she and her mother moved to Washington, but her father, who was an itinerant preacher, did not join them. Instead, her mother took on the primary responsibility of raising and supporting her daughter on a domestic's wages, enabling her to graduate in 1896 from the most prestigious Black high school in D.C., although she and her mother were not and never would be a part of that city's old Black elite class. And it was for that reason, when she tried to get a job as a teacher in the public schools, for which she was well qualified and well trained, she was denied that job, and the position went to someone with more political connections and lighter skin color. This kind of, this joining of class and colorism really set her on a different path. Now, fortunately for her, even though she had that high school education, she was already deeply religious, but she'd also trained with stenographic and bookkeeping skills, and like, you gotta have a backup plan. So that was her backup plan, and she soon found work in Louisville with the Foreign Mission Board of the National Baptist Convention. So she moved there in 1896 from Washington, took work as a secretary and an assistant, making Louisville her home for over a decade. There, she joined into Baptist women's societies, set up a citywide industrial club for women with classes in bookkeeping and shorthand and typing, sewing, cooking, and childcare. And it was during that time that she first rose to prominence in Baptist churches and Baptist circles nationwide. So in 1900, she gave a speech at the National Baptist Convention, and the title of it will tell us pretty much everything we need to know. The speech was entitled, "How the Sisters Are Hindered from Helping," a sentiment that foreshadowed her drive to help Black Baptist women establish their own voice and mission. So Burroughs then goes on to use her position as a religious leader of Black women, because she eventually would be elected corresponding secretary of the Women's Auxiliary for the National Baptist Convention. She used that as an organizing form, and she started to write and speak even more bluntly on a wide range of matters, including the weaknesses of both Black and white Christianity, the weaknesses of ministerial leadership in general. She gave speeches, she wrote tracts, she had a column in the newspaper, and in all of that, she was urging Black people to use their Baptist faith to help sustain the spirits and the morale of the masses of African Americans who remained poor, uneducated, and exploited. She repeatedly urged Black Baptist men and women to embody a Christianity that was both protest and service-oriented, that engaged with the political issue of race, and that used its human and financial resources to help Black people escape demoralization and hopelessness, positions she saw as byproducts of their poverty and of racial discrimination. And at the same time, she challenged the hypocrisy of white Christianity and a segregated, racially unjust American democracy, and advocated for an end to Jim Crow. She also then, as part of her work at the Baptist Convention, she also realized her dream of establishing a religious training school for women and girls, something she did in 1909 across the river in Washington, D.C., so she left Louisville to come back to Washington. She saw that school as a place to train Black women as religious workers and to prepare them for the heavy responsibilities that they already held in those churches. So the first goal was to train them to be politically and publicly engaged Christian lay leaders, and then to try to transform churches to do that work. I mean, that church still, well, I'll come back to the fate of that in a minute. But this was 8 acres of land in northeast Capitol, which the women, northeast of the Capitol, which the women were able to fund. No direct subvention from the National Baptist Convention, and no substantial funding from whites. These are the wages of working class Black women. Needless to say, the fact that this was made, owned, and worked by Black women created a lot of tension within the National Baptist Convention. And as you can imagine, that attempt to create something for Black women caused a lot of heat and discussion and disputes within the larger male-run National Baptist Convention. Undaunted, Burroughs vowed that she would simply continue to focus on her work, and this is Burroughs. "I am going right on serving the Lord unless they tackle me, and then I'm going to serve him with one hand and fight them with the other." So she comes, this is who she was, and just a really powerful and powerfully committed person. So when she comes back to Washington, she starts to write a weekly column on all of the issues of the day. She becomes an avid supporter of the NAACP, and she's urging people to fight for anti-lynching legislation and a whole other spate of things that are going on in that period. She protests segregation on trains. She argues that Jim Crow cars and the so-called Iron Curtain that was there separating the races were both schemes designed, she said, quote, to crucify our racial self-respect. She took very seriously her identification with the plight of Black women, especially working class women like her own mother, who had been born in and had borne the burden of slavery, had labored as domestics, lived on low wages, and still managed to raise children alone. So both personally and professionally, she's empathizing with Black women's burdens and their responsibilities. She always does. That's kind of her North Star. She was even more adamant about the necessity for Black churches to engage in public service missions. She ridiculed efforts to build elaborate church sanctuaries as a waste of precious community resources, with a caveat, with a warning. She says, if we have the idea that our mission as Christians is simply to build and equip churches, we are entirely mistaken as to God's supreme purpose in sending his Son into the world. Instead, she called on churches to use their existing buildings to serve as teaching institutions, as community centers, and not just for church people or Black people, but for humanity in general. And all of you should be proud that this church is living into that dream and even into that mission. So this is not just her being a part of uplift ideology, the idea that we lift as we climb, that we try to bring up those who have less than we do, that that's part of what she's doing. Something else is going on when we get to the 1950s, and that's where I want to spend the remainder of my time, and then I'll open up for some comments and questions with you. So in the 1950s, you see this dramatic shift. She, like many other Black leaders, a dramatic shift in the possibility of racial progress. So she and other Black leaders began to anticipate that the judicial challenges being mounted by the NAACP would soon topple the legal barriers of segregation, especially in education. The prospect that an end to legalized segregation would open new opportunities for Black people brought feelings, really mixed feelings. It's feelings of joy mixed with real fears that this was an opportunity as fragile as it was rare. A palpable anxiety began to set in due to fears that neither Blacks nor whites would be prepared for that eventuality, would be prepared for desegregation. Whites, because their belief in white superiority was so ingrained, and Blacks, because they lacked the skills, the self-confidence, and the self-respect needed to take full advantage, and the training, frankly, and education to take full advantage of anticipated new opportunities in a desegregated world. She also specifically warned more privileged Black middle-class people away from racial abandonment in the rush towards a desegregated world. She urged them instead to help bring poor Black people back into racial communion that would restore their faith in themselves in the future. But once again, she places the church in the central role of bridging those intra-racial class differences, saying that, quote, the improvement of the Negro masses should be the dominant concern and responsibility of every Negro church, using the term of the day. So this becomes even more passionate for Burroughs, and actually for a whole number of Black people in that period. We think of the Brown decision, which is where I'm going now, which led to the desegregation of schools, as a high point, but people were really nervous about that and how or if it actually might work. She, gave money and had the convention give money to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. She invited Thurgood Marshall to come speak to the Women's Convention in 1954 because she wanted people to be really informed and up to date on what's happening. And for Burroughs, this sort of trepidation and fear about the future, she talked about it this way. Neither race is ready for integration. For nearly 100 years, with not enough exceptions, parents, teachers, and other adults in the white race have been teaching their children that the Negro race is innately inferior and that the white race is innately superior, that just being white makes them superior. This doctrine has been taught in the home and in the school and practiced by American churches by separation and silence. So she sees that the weight of white notions of white superiority, a weight under which we still struggle every single day. As for blacks, she worried that they had been, quote, bruised, broken, strangled, and made bitter as a result of their mistreatment, of discrimination, of injustice, and segregation. And so that's why she thought neither group was psychologically prepared for this transition into a desegregated society. And she's writing in 1954. Now, she also then had the idea of hosting for the Women's Convention meeting a relatively unknown new member of Dexter Baptist Church, a 27-year-old Martin Luther King Jr. Coming a year before the commencement of the Montgomery bus boycott, which starts in 1955, and his association with that, Burroughs is not acting out of prescience or about King's later emergence into national leadership. Rather, she was operating out of her long acquaintance with King's family. She knew his maternal grandfather, who had been a treasurer in the National Convention, and most importantly, she was friendly with both of King's parents, and especially his mother, Alberta, who was very active in the Women's Convention and an admirer of Burroughs and her work. So that when Burroughs assumes the presidency of the Women's Convention, she appoints Mrs. King to its music division, and she serves as an organist for all of their national meetings. So it's no surprise that when Burroughs wanted to invite the younger King, Martin King Jr., to speak at the Women's Convention, she approached him through his mother. Now, King's speech to the Baptist women was called Vision of a World Made New. And this is a speech that's not as well known. But in it, we see him, even as a 27-year-old, saying that we were living in a period where there was a divine discontent, and that's his term, with the old order, and we're working to realize a vision of a new order. And he juxtaposes the old and the new, pairing injustice and justice, darkness and light, an old New Jerusalem and a new Jerusalem, and endorsing John's revelation of a new heaven and a new earth. And he reserved his speech's high point for condemning the Christian church as a whole and its alliance both with the colonizing orders in place then in South Africa and in India, and with segregation in the United States. So we see Burroughs and King aligned in their analysis of what's happening here, but also what's happening around the world. And they both are struggling about how do we maintain some sense of racial collectivity if desegregation is really going to be coming our way. And especially because she expected that class differences would widen in a desegregated world, that there would be some black people who would be able to make it, but most would not. So what do we do then as a race, in those circumstances? She had the Women's Convention support the Montgomery bus boycott, and the King family directly sent them money. In a letter to his parents, to Martin Luther King's parents, she wrote, "The enclosed is my personal expression of interest in the calm, sure way that Junior," and this is what she called him, that Junior is standing up for right and righteousness. Now, the younger King would soon respond to her gift, but it was her mother who wrote first to thank Burroughs and she called her an encouraging, and what she wrote, an encouraging, uplifting letter, saying, "It came at a time which such words added value, for as you know, we have been and are still deeply concerned over the Montgomery situation and our son, thinking of the safety of him and his family. Though in the face of danger, he says he cannot recant, he cannot walk off and leave the people now. So I feel, as I have been done before, that God will protect and deliver him from all harm." So this is an important reminder that we see Martin Luther King and his martyrdom and everything that he did, but these are real, regular people worried about their son who is standing on the precipice and doing work that they know endangers him deeply. And so these letters really capture the poignancy of their relationship with her, but also that this is really what's going on in people's hearts and home. She invites King to come. She and King both appear at the National Baptist Convention in 1956, and I'm going to move to a close in a few minutes, for the annual National Baptist meetings, 1956 in Denver. She does a speech that basically says the only continuous sacrificial support for Black church leaders has always come directly from the masses of Black people in the pews. But she saw most of them as sheep without shepherds. It's a critique of the lack of meaningful Black ministerial leadership in that moment. And so she calls on Black preachers there to, quote, "deliver the masses from the bondage of their death and to awaken the classes from their lack of real interest in mass improvement and a smug sense of escape and security." And that's a lesson and a sermon we probably still need to hear. And she uses King as an example of the possibility. She says it is the business of the educated Negro to write, to teach, and to guide the masses, not only into understanding, but it's the business of the Negro church leaders to stop trying to lead from behind. Now, that September, King then invites Burroughs to come and speak on the anniversary of the start of the Montgomery bus boycott. So she goes there. He calls her the first leader of Negro women in America. And he invites her, he says, "It's imperative that you come to give hope to the thousands of women who are paying the price of sacrifice in our struggle." And by that, he means Black domestics, Black working class women who stood off those buses even though they needed to get across town to the white communities to work in those white people's homes. They stayed off of those buses. And that's why he knows it's the sacrifice of Black women that makes that boycott possible and that lifts them up. By the end we get towards the end of Burroughs' life, she dies in 1961, she's still arguing for what she calls a peace force drawn from people of every country and race and color and from every religion and none, who will be the pioneers of a new undiscovered country. People joining this movement, she wrote, regardless of their religious beliefs or whether they are religious or not, they need to have a divine enthusiasm for tolerance and forgiveness. So she calls for an army of people through prayer and action who are willing to try to undo this racial crisis in America and to move this country away from what she calls unchristian practices, undemocratic attitudes, and unconstitutional application of laws. Once again, these are words that ring true here in 2025. She wouldn't live to see the civil rights achievements fully realized. As I said, she passes away in the spring of 1961. And before she dies, she invites Benjamin Mays, the president of Morehouse, former dean of the Divinity School at Howard, renowned intellectual and preacher himself. She invites him to come see her, to tell her what's going on in Atlanta. In recounting that, he says that despite her age, her mind was still young. She asked him to come and meet with her, and she told him, she said, "I want to make sure that the sit-in demonstrations are not a fly-by-night thing." She wanted to know what was being done to guarantee the continuation of the sit-ins until every vestige of discrimination had been abolished. So here she is, literally on her deathbed, even as her life was ending. She's staying on the work that's yet to be done. And Mays, who ultimately also preaches her funeral, reports that to us. And she ends up by calling for a creative, dedicated minority of people, because it's always a minority of people who will make the world better. The last thing that she wrote that I want to share with you, and then I'd be happy to discuss anything I've said with you, she wrote, and this was earlier in her life, she says, "That indefinable thing that we call time travels so fast that the past is gone and the present becomes the past, even while we attempt to define it, and like the flash of the lightning, it at once exists and expires." And so I say, now is our time as she would have it, for us to continue to define the mission and the work of our own lives before our own days expire. But also, I say, I feel that I'm standing in a church that embodies everything that Burroughs wished and dreamed and hoped for. And I hope that we can continue to take some inspiration from her life as you continue to do the important work of the day here.
Thank you so much. We're going to go right into questions. If you have a question, I'm going to invite you to come to the mic so that our online community can hear.
Well, they still look awake, so.
That's right. It takes a minute. Here we go.
I just didn't want to go first. And I don't want Pastor Judy to get me, so I'm going to talk quickly. It's a pleasure to talk to you, Professor.
Thank you.
From Nat Turner to Fannie Lou Hamer, the Black church has been there. You mentioned him offered the best chance for mobilization. One of my favorite examples is Earl Little, Malcolm X's father, gets followed by Little Malcolm as an itinerant preacher promoting for Marcus Garvey. And then he uses that to grow the Nation of Islam. We also had Jesse Jackson's run. We had MLK's letter from Birmingham jail promoting, showing that we had the moral authority on our side. But then you kind of fast forward to the present with some leaders from BLM, for example, who sideline Black faith in general.
From where, Black Lives Matter?
From Black Lives Matter.
Okay, I'm going to disagree with you about that. Go ahead.
I'm not saying the entire movement.
Yeah.
I'm saying that, but there are some who try to sideline Black faith. So what I was wondering is, do you see it at anywhere where Black Christianity is kind of moved aside in Black American cultural discourse? And if you do, when did that begin to happen? Does it begin to happen with the Black Power movement? Does it begin to happen with the growth of the Black middle class and Black wealth? So if you do see it, I was wondering where that might be. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And I didn't mean to jump on you there. I was acting like a teacher with a student. That's not appropriate. I was like, no, that's not. Okay.
I was in the history program at UIC under Barbara Ransby,
yeah,
so I'm okay.
Speaking of Black Power and activism, so let me just say something of the Black Lives Matter movement, and I didn't mean to jump at it, because ultimately what you said is correct. I mean, there were tensions between the Black Lives Matter movement and traditional church leadership. When I first sort of met with and was involved with young people in the Black Lives Matter movement, I was at a forum that they did at Mother Bethel, and they asked me to come and sit with them and be a part of that because I study religion. And so what was really interesting to me about that, and this is a lens through which I viewed part of that movement, when it was its liveliest, is that as I met these young people, they were very churchy. Like, there are a lot of people in the early stages of that movement who were involved out of the same sort of spiritual religious impulse, but they were disinfected with traditional black church practices, not unlike Burroughs in the sense they thought the churches weren't doing enough, people weren't leading enough, they were, mega churches just taking the money, building sanctuaries, not doing anything in the community. So they had a critique, but many of them were still very spiritually grounded. A lot of them were kids of preachers, so when I met them, I thought they were churchy, and I meant that in the best sense of the word, and that really surprised me. And even when I met the 3 women who founded it, because we brought them we gave them awards at the University of Pennsylvania, so I had a chance to sit with them, and their spiritual underpinning was also always there, because you need something to hold on to when you're just talking about death and destruction and putting your own life there. So I don't disagree with you, but I have given, in fact, it was a talk I almost was going to give here. I've given a fairly long talk about the Black Lives Matter movement because that was a very intriguing moment. So let me just put that there. So when did black churches get decentered? I mean, is that an apt summary? Well, that's a really hard question to answer because it's not just black churches, it's all churches, all traditional religious organizations, Pastor Jim knows this better than I do, long move towards secular institutions, people pulling away from religious institutions. In fact, it's a very prominent mark of the 20th century that it's happening everywhere. When it happens to black people, because the churches are so important, it hurts us more, those of us who see the church as an instrument and as a mechanism. And part of what I write about when I write about African American religion is that one of the reasons that black churches are so important is the dearth or the absence of other black institutions. And I say that both, it's true even during and before the Civil Rights Movement, there are other black institutions in the segregated society. The church is the strongest of them, but if we think about a black press, and historically black institutions, colleges and universities, I mean, they survive beyond integration, although I cannot tell you that there aren't losses there because people like me in 1970 went to the University of Virginia rather than Hampton or Virginia State. I mean, there are consequences to integration too. And so I feel like I try to historicize that to say this has been going on for a long time. It matters more for us, and it matters more for us as conditions do not improve. So things continue to be bad, and people continue to suffer in really different ways post-integration, post-desegregation. And there are limitations on what a church can do, actually, especially if a church, say not this church, but most churches don't look like this. Most black churches are small, local, and may not be this affluent, have this kind of resources. So it is a lot to expect from churches, and so I don't have an answer to that problem. I just like to say it didn't just start now, and so we have to just kind of sit where we are and figure out what we're going to do right now, in the 21st century. That was a long answer. I apologize. I'll curb my answers some. I know how you are. Okay. Okay.
Your answer for that actually answered an online question, so that you took out 2 with 1 answer.
That's my goal.
Dr. Savage, I want to thank you for...
What is your name?
Valerie.
Hi, thank you.
I want to thank you for how you have laid out the social activism through individual lives of church leadership and others, because it answers a contemporary question that we have with education. When in history, traditional American history, you don't get this. You don't get to know anything about people like Nanny, Burroughs, or any of our leaders. And I think that was one of the things that I had looked at a few years ago when I had looked at the master class that was done by Dr. Cornell West and others.
Yes.
And they were doing a critique of the educational system. But also I want to bring it back to somebody else, and I want to see if you agree with me. That's Carter G. Woodson, who talked about the miseducation of the Negro. I read his book, picked it up one day, was dropping my grandson off at Howard, and I read the book in entirety, and he was right. But he also critiqued it not just that it was a Black American issue, that it was an American issue. Because if white people don't know our history, they're just as dumb. And I'm not saying, you know, to be facetious or just mean-spirited. I'm just saying it in an intellectual sense. But I do appreciate, do you see it like that, though?
Yes, I do. I agree with you. And thank you for raising up Carter G. Woodson, because he, of course, was the founder of Negro History Week, which later became, you know, Black History Month, journal, which is now the Journal of African American History, which is still a very, very valuable resource. And as a child of the South who grew up in a country church, and in a segregated school system, I was in the last all-Black class in Southampton County, Virginia, home of Nat Turner, somebody raised up Nat Turner. There you go. So I know a little bit about the Nottoway. So I say that as someone who experienced that and then went to the University of Virginia. I'm not the only one, but in the early 70s, out of an all-Black high school and then into that setting. And I was reminded of it because very recently I've celebrated, I won't say what number, but class reunions of both, almost back to back. And so I went to my high school reunion. I'm very happy to see everybody, all of us Black. And then I went to my UVA reunion. Okay, and I have 2 photographs of that, and I'm going to write an essay, and I'm going to write an essay called "The Story of 2 Photographs." And so there I am, like there are a couple little people there, but into a very different environment. But what I talk about and what I learned from that, and I always credit everything I have done to growing up in that rural church in Virginia, but also to the Black high school teachers who came out of HBCUs and who taught me how to speak. I mean, everything I know about how to try to talk, I was forced to learn in church and in school. And so we were taught Black history because it was just us. Right. And we were taught it there, and we were also taught it at church, in part because the same teacher who you had during the day would be your Sunday school teacher on Sunday. And there would be no escape. And Mrs. Brown would stop at our house on Fridays and say, "Oh, you need to memorize this by Sunday." And I was like, "I have to memorize The Creation by James Weldon Johnson by Sunday?" And she said, "Yes, I know you can," and I did. All right, there you go. So I'm with you on that. Is that all right? Yeah, okay.
Vertically challenged here. My question is, first of all, it's been very informative, so thank you.
Thank you.
But my question is, you had stated that particularly the women, but church in general, didn't get the visibility and the power that it got later on. And I had the question of King seemed to bring together the Jewish population and some Catholic religions. Was that intentional in order to increase the power and visibility of our struggle? Mm-hmm. And was that driven by women, or was that driven by the male leadership, or does it even really matter?
That's a really great question, and I'll try to answer it this way and just use kind of one example, which I think will give you a sense of what people are thinking. I think sometimes because African Americans are so visible, at least now, so visible in the culture, in the music, that we forget we're still only 10% of the population. We're always only 10% of the population. And so if you're that much of a minority, if all of us, and not everybody's going to be engaged, there's a lot of diversity within that. So the importance of white allies who have power, access, money, and religious allies was really essential. It wasn't the driving force by any means, but it was, to me, it was a necessary political attempt. And you see it realized most visibly in the March on Washington in 1963, because that's where people can see it. It's got, there are people from all religious faiths, but the 40,000 white Protestants who showed up at that march were organized by a black woman named Annie Arnold Hedgeman. That was her job, was to get the white people there, and she did. So I say that it is a strategy, and it's a moment where you can sense this possibility of what this country says it wants to be and what it could look like. And that was made visible on television for all to see in August of 1963. So that was a part, and it actually is true to the rhetoric and the ideas and the morality of the movement. We were trying to say we are all equal, treat us as if Black Lives Matter, treat us equally. And if you're on that program, come on up in here. We need you to help us get to that point and to make this nation what it says it wants to be. Mm-hmm. You're the timekeeper? Mm-hmm.
Take this, I've got, are
Okay.
you gonna come up, sir? Then you'll be the last.
Ooh.
Yes.
All right.
Come on, yeah.
So,
Good morning.
My name is Cornelius. You spoke a lot about the National Baptist Convention.
Yeah, people, I can hear you, but I don't think everybody,
Okay.
thank you.
You spoke a lot about the National Baptist Convention and then the women auxiliaries, and I guess I just wanted to know more about the role that they had just in civil rights in general, and then what do you think their role could be in the future?
Could be what?
In the future.
What their role could be in the future. I cannot speak for the Baptist Church in the future or in the present, because I am for any number, well, because I'm not a Baptist, so I'm not going to try to do that. But if I could, broaden it out more to talk about Black religious women more generally and their engagement. And I'll talk, actually, the second part of the little talk here, I'll hit on that issue if you're still here. Okay. I'll hit on that a little bit more directly. But I actually am not an expert on what's going on with the Women's Convention now and its strength, so I'm not going to try to address that. But I think when we think about people like how many Black religious women are politically engaged in whatever way, starting from actually Vice President Harris, who sat over there on December 22nd, because I looked at the video. If we think about Stacey Abrams and the work that she was doing and is still doing, I think both of her parents are preachers, and I got that right, and her faith is right at the core of what she's doing. It is not the only way to find a moral underpinning, but you got to have something, because that kind of work that is being done in the streets and organizing around violence and anti-violence, it requires courage and replenishment just to get up the next day and say, I'm going to get out there and fight this fight again. So I think that and sometimes that religiosity has disappeared because it doesn't look like this. It doesn't look like what we're used to seeing, as in the Black Lives Matter movement. And there are also disagreements about, within. But I do think that there is a core within Black churches that has to be involved and that is involved. We need more of everything and more of everyone. So, thank you.
No, thank you.
That's great. We have two more questions. Come on.
Hi, my name is Tammy Washington, and I was just wondering, how do we move forward and not backwards with the current situation that's going on? How do we move forward as a body of people, whether you're white, Black, purple, green, whatever? How do we move forward so that we don't go back? Yep,
And I think that's a question, thank you so much for that. I think that's a question we're all asking ourselves, and it's a question that kind of keeps you awake at night, and that you can feel a certain amount of hopelessness and despair about. And I'll say, I spent the whole month of November dressed in black. Well, I'm still dressed in we are still in grief and mourning in that way, and that's not inappropriate. And I was talking to a friend the other day, and I think the thing that we came to, and that because she's more optimistic generally than I am, so those are the people you need when you're just like, I can't see any way out of this. And it really does come back to community. That is that we can get all this information overload, which is everywhere. The bad stuff is coming. I don't let it come into my house, literally. I get enough to know what's going on, but you have to protect yourself. You have to have on an armor to protect yourself from the evil that we're seeing, and I use that word on purpose. And you need to be in community, however you create it, however you define it, with like-minded people. And you can sit together and say, how are we going to get through this, and how are we going to take care of ourselves and our families and get through this, and then how are we going to go forward and do something to help the person around the corner? How are we going to, engage politically, which we're going to continue, to do. Your pastor in that service is, he's looking towards the midterm elections. That's one place to be. There are people living on the streets in Philadelphia. I'm sure there are in D.C. There are lots of places where we can decide that we need to help somebody in some way. And if we can surround ourselves in community, that's what we gotta have.
Good morning, all, and thank you for your presentation, Doctor. So
what's your name?
My name is Ayn Reed.
Thank you.
Part of your lecture was speaking to political power within the church, and brought us to the historical understanding. I think we saw when Reverend Wright was chastised when 44 was president. I think it caused a chilling effect for political power that was engaged since Dr. King was alive. That was also internal and external. BLM represented an external but not an internal capacity. How do we now get to a place where our religious leaders are engaged with the continual struggle, as Ms. Burroughs was pushing, when they've been chilled, right? Because it's happened at 44, where they were collectively pushed out or devoiced.
Yes.
And now we're trying to re-engage where that moral compass is not only the black church, right? We're seeing now in the Senate, it's maybe a non-black idea through Mormonism. So how do we get to a place where that's re-engaged so that the black church and black women that are pushing for that balance within our society to exist?
All right, thank you, and thank you for that. And I think, again, that's a question that we're asking. It's actually a question that Martin King was asking towards the end of his life. One of his last books was called, Where Do We Go From Here? Where do we go from here? And that was in the late 1960s. I can't speak for religious leadership. Maybe Pastor Judy can, in particular, and maybe she wants to. Do you want to come say something?
I will say this. I'll say one thing. I think we have to think about black religious leadership more broadly defined. Yes. That black religious leadership involves what we traditionally think of as preachers, but it also involves scholars, and it involves activists. So if we think about it that way, black religious leadership is a diverse group. And that often when we say we have a problem or a question about black religious leadership, we're talking about a specific construct. Part of the conversation we need to be diverse. I've had the opportunity to sit in rooms with a diverse group of black religious leaders coming at these challenges from different places with an understanding that our strength comes from being in the big room together. I think going forward, the church and African Americans need to honor the tradition of the civil rights movement, but remember it more correctly. And remember it not simply as Martin Luther King, that is all the people that it took to do that. So we are not looking for the next leader, we're looking for the next convening of people. And that's all of us.
See, she does have an answer. Thank you.
We are going to take a break. It's 10:45. We'll take a comfort break and come back at 11.
Thank you.
Yes, I made the TikTok yesterday, but I deleted it because I wanted to. Okay, I'll try to do TikTok now. Bye.
Do you know you have like 30 minutes?
Yes, I know, but I need more time.
I know you need more time, but we're actually in the middle of Seek. You know, this is not all about TikToks.
You know what? Dad, I can't do this. You have to give me 2 to 3 more hours.
Charlie, I think we can try.
No, I can't. My friends, my viewers, and my followers are all depending on me.
I know that, but what about God? He's depending on you too.
God can do TikTok dances too.
God does know how to do TikTok dances.
Now, Charlie, did I hear you say I can't?
Yes.
You know we can do all things through Christ in this family. So you have 30 more minutes to do your dance video for your friends.
But I have to take like 30 shots, and that's gonna take me a whole hour. I need more hours, more minutes, I need more everything.
And we now have 29 more minutes to do our dance video.
Why not?
Can't give you more time. We have Seek and we've made a commitment as a family.
My name is Charlie, and I'm a 10-year-old TikTok star. I can't believe my parents. I feel like they tried to get me to start Seek after they realized I was blowing up and all that. What is the Seek? What am I seeking? Because I haven't played hide and seek since I was in 2nd grade. But 40 more minutes, please?
Absolutely not. You only have 27 more minutes now. And we've agreed as a family to do Seek together.
Okay.
That's your child.
How many more days of this do we have?
39. Hi, we're the Freedmans. I'm Jade, and this is my lovely husband, David.
Right. Please don't call me Dave. He owns a chain of restaurants, and I'm more like King David.
Amen. And this holy household is going to be participating in Seek 2025.
40 days? Is it 40 nights?
Sure.
All right. We are sacrificing to get closer to God.
This time is going to be spent in prayer, spending more quality time with family. We have 2 hours on our devices, as well as being with the Lord in prayer and supplication.
And we're going to slow the spending.
We are.
Oh, and our daughter, Charlie, she's clearly in her TikTok era.
Yes, she thinks she's a star, and apparently she's gone viral. However, during Seek, she's going to put that phone down.
But she is a star, though.
But she has one more time.
One more time.
One more time.
But we're gonna do it.
We will, and we hope you will too. Do not forget to go to alfredstreet.org for more information on tips and tools and the rules for Seek 2025.
Boom ba-dum boom boom ba-dum boom boom ba-dum boom baby. Boom ba-dum boom boom ba-dum boom boom ba-dum boom baby.
So we're in week 2 now, and I think it's been really good for us as a family. So far, we're all kind of getting on board, and I just thought it would be really, really nice if I wrote a letter to all of my online retailers. So of course, my Amazon letter had to be first, and I know David will love it.
Jade, are you seriously writing a letter to Amazon?
Hi, honey. I did. I just wanted them to know where I've been and to not miss me. So do you want to hear it?
Please.
Dear Amazon, I know you're wondering where I've been. It's me, not you. My church is participating in Seek. Have you heard of it? Call Pastor Wesley if you have any questions. I'm sure he'll love that. But rest assured, I haven't forgotten about you, and I will be back in 32 days. Love, Jade, your #1 customer. Didn't you like the letter, though?
I thought it was a bit dramatic. Anytime you write a letter to the founder of Amazon to let them know that you'll be back, it's giving delusion. Delulu. I mean, wow, with a letter like this, it would be impossible to forget about you.
I just want to communicate, since we are doing this fast and that they haven't seen me for 2 weeks. So I'm taking time now, after the letter, to create some homemade gifts and crafts, and hopefully Charlie can participate as well, since we can't do any online purchasing.
Can we have one more day of Seek?
No, we're gonna have to do the remaining 32 days. However, we can do some crafts. Do you want to help?
No, I don't. How long is Seek? It's already been a week. That kind of hurt my neck a bit.
And I'm gonna need a few more materials.
A coffee filter?
It's gonna work. You just gotta pray about it. Some paint, the broom, and it's gonna come together, I believe. Are you gonna join us with the craft?
I'm gonna go get all the materials.
It'd be a nice family event, crafting together.
Yes.
Lord help me as we come up with these ideas.
All right, saints, it is 11 o'clock, so we'd like to have you return to your seats. We want to take advantage of everything that Dr. Savage has to give to us. So we welcome her back, Dr. Barbara Savage.
Thank you, and thank you all for staying and for great questions. And just to kind of pick up where we were a minute ago when we were talking about the role of Black religious institutions in where do we go from here. And I think it's also important to remember that when we talk about African American religion, we're also not just talking about Christianity, even though that's where we are, but we're also talking about alliances in the religious diversity of Black people. We sometimes forget that this is the last number, that 30% of folks in this country who are Muslims are people of African descent. This is, traditional Islam. Someone asked me a question about the Nation of Islam right now, which I cannot answer and which I would promise to kind of look into, but there is still, a way for us to also embrace with folks who practice African-derived religions as well, and we can bring our Christian witness in whatever ways that we manifest it, but into spaces wherever people are trying to unite and do some good in the world. So now, having dragged you through the 17th and 18th century and into the 20th, I really just want to talk a little bit about the civil rights movement itself, and I'm going to use the same kind of format of talking about 2 or 3 different people, because I think it's through the lives of individuals that we really do get an interesting sense of what it is that people did in moments that were at least as bad as the moment that we now face. So I want to talk a little bit about the civil rights movement as a religious rebellion, And the first person I want to talk about is Fannie Lou Hamer, who may be known to many of you or some of you, but for those who may not, let me just say that this is a woman who was born in the Mississippi Delta in 1917 to a large family headed by 2 sharecroppers, which would have been fairly typical for Black people in Mississippi in that period. Her parents were devoutly religious, and they taught her that hatred would destroy her spirit if she gave into it. And it was a warning that was designed to blunt the impact of all of the violence and injustices and so much suffering that she saw even as a child growing up there. Because she was a child of sharecroppers, typically she was forced to leave school and go to work. She joined a Baptist church in order to improve her reading skills in Bible study once she was outside of school. After 1942, she marries. She and her husband continued to work as sharecroppers because there's no other possibilities for her. But her literacy and her facility with numbers led her to her duties as a timekeeper for the plantation's other workers. So she was a timekeeper and had those skills. And it was in that position, because she could read and because she knew math, that she could see how much the white plantation owners were cheating Black workers out of their wages. Sometimes, especially by underweighing the amount of cotton that they had picked. So you'd pick all day and bring your bag of cotton, you would be paid based on the weight of that. And she could see folks being cheated out of that. And so she counteracted that, really at great risk to herself, because she had a little hidden set of weights of her own that she would use to balance the scales in favor of the workers. She said years later, I didn't know what else to do, and all I could do is rebel in the only way I could rebel. And so she would use what she could in that particular moment. And so when we think about rebellion and where and when we rebel, this is an example of someone's doing what she can do in that particular time and place. Because of that, and because she could read and had mathematical skills, she also establishes herself as a community leader and as someone willing to fight for what she thought was right. So she heard an announcement in her church in 1962 about a mass meeting with a group of young people who had come to Mississippi, who had come to the Delta to help African Americans register to vote. She was really intrigued by this, but she was also cautious and I think somewhat afraid. The meeting was held at a church other than her own because her own church would not host that meeting. So she went to the only church that would open its doors to such a gathering. And that's where she first heard SNCC students, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee students, and SCLC, which was the group that Martin Luther King was a part of, explain to folks in that church in Mississippi that as adult citizens, even though they were black people in Mississippi, they still had the right to register and to vote. And she says later, until then, I'd never heard of no mass meeting, and I didn't know that a Negro could register and vote. So it was a young James Bevel of the SCLC who preached a riveting sermon calling on everyone there to heed the biblical imperative to recognize the signs of the times as one would prepare for a storm and urge people to act to try to secure their own rights. She was so inspired by that sermon, and she was motivated to register to vote to try to set some things right. I could not just see myself, she said, I could just see myself voting people out of office that I know was wrong and didn't do nothing to help the poor. So the meeting ends with a call for the first set of volunteers, and Hamer steps forward in that church and in that moment to lead a group of 18 people who are going to go to the courthouse in Indianola, Mississippi, to claim their right to register to vote. Of course, their claim was refused and retaliation was swift. Hamer and her family were driven off the plantation where they had lived and worked for many years, and they were forced to go into hiding to protect themselves. And after a few months, Hamer felt religiously and politically strong enough and compelled enough to return to continue the fight that she'd helped to begin in that county. She was aware of the dangers and the risk involved, but she came back to Ruleville, Mississippi, and eventually succeeded in registering to vote. I think that success, getting registered to vote, brought her more violence and more threats, but it also emboldened her to try to do more civil rights organizing. She encouraged other black people to join the movement, including preachers whom she believed to be lagging in assuming community leadership. She herself often broke church protocol by challenging preachers while they were in their own pulpits, relying on her own deep knowledge of the Bible, because remember, she learned to read by reading the Bible, so she knew her Bible. She would interrupt them to argue for their involvement in the community. And one of her friends later said, see, you really ain't supposed to ask no preacher no questions in the middle of a sermon. But see, Mrs. Hamer would get up and disrupt the sermon and want to know certain things that he didn't talk about in terms of how it related to our daily survival. Hamer saw herself as rebelling not just against white racism, but also against traditional black leadership, both religious and secular, which she considered more a hindrance than a help. Eventually, Hamer's work would lead her to her arrest in a Winona, Mississippi bus station as she and a group of women were returning from a citizenship training session. So they had gone to be trained how better to do the work they were engaged in. She and the two activist women, who were named June Johnson and Nanelle Ponder, they were then taken into police custody and beaten savagely for their work. The jailer's white wife and daughter took pity on the women and would secretly come in and give the women cold water and ice. This isn't in the heat of the Mississippi Delta. So even as Hamer is suffering tremendous pain, physical pain, she remains defiant and committed to teaching them a larger lesson. And so this is Hamer speaking to the woman and the daughter who come in to offer them cold water and ice. She says, I told them, y'all is nice, you must be Christian people. And the jailer's wife told me that she tried to live a Christian life. And I told her I would like for her to read 2 scriptures in the Bible. And I told her to read the 26th of Proverbs and the 26th verse, which for those of you who know your Bible better than I do, reads, "Whose hatred is covered by deceit, his wickedness shall be showed before the whole congregation." And she said, oh, the white woman wrote it down on a piece of paper. And then I told her to read the 17th chapter of Acts in the 26th verse, which says, "Hath made of one blood all nations of men for to dwell on all the face of the earth." And she wrote that down. And then Hamer says, and they never came back after that. So it's courage to stand there. It's courage and pride to stand there, but also to know that the thing that was bringing them some bit of respite and some bit of comfort, that ice and water would be at risk. And she put that at risk, and that was lost. So we see someone like Hamer, who's part of that fluid political collective that we know as the Civil Rights Movement, which is never about one person. It's always about many, many nameless people, a few of whom have made it into our historical records. We also know that Southern Black churches provide the common culture and the sanctuary for that movement. And it represented a coalition, and this goes back to the earlier question, actually, of Southerners and Northerners from different economic and social backgrounds, different generations, different political philosophies, different races and religions. But regardless of their own spiritual orientation, few of them were unaffected by the power of the Black religious faith which they witnessed, many of whom were witnessing it for the first time, because they were meeting in those small churches, they were in those sit-ins and marches, and so they all become a part of what is an activist minority, including religious rebels like Hamer, whose courage and persistence led this revolution. Religion, of course, was also a really formative influence on John Lewis, someone we're very much more familiar with. And he also talks about the richness and vitality of Black rural church life in Alabama of his youth. So he grew up in a community full of those little country churches, like the one that I grew up in Virginia. And so what he reminds us is that going to those churches after you've been working as sharecroppers, as his family was, all of that long, hard, hot physical labor, going to the church, being with other Black people, was a source of joy, of relief, of sweet inspiration. And that's part of what nurtured him into the work that he was later to do. Those churches were so small that they couldn't have services but once a month. They were often served by a pastor who was pastoring 3 or 4 of those churches at one time. But it also meant that when you had free Sundays, if you're a Baptist and the Baptist church is not meeting, you go over to the AME church. So that there is this larger community of faith that, I'm not saying the denominational lines are irrelevant, but it's basically we're going to somebody's Black church today. And in all of those places, church for him became an exciting place, a really colorful place, a vibrant place, but also a place of community and fellowship of other Black people. And so it's the communal nature of those gatherings that he sees as the same spirit of strength, and that's his term, the same spirit of strength that we see at the center of the Civil Rights Movement. He says it was the spirit of, quote, simple people, everyday people, good, honest, hardworking people struggling against the odds to try to make ends meet and to take care of their families. Is it any wonder, he wrote, that come Sunday their voices were lifted so strongly and so openly to God in the face of their own personal struggles? So he knew firsthand, as did Hamer, though he was much younger, about the deprivations and the denial that was the heart of the racist system in the South, and that his family would remain in poverty. But his family's faith in God was rivaled only by their faith in education and their drive to give their children the best schooling possible, despite the fact that they didn't have much cash. He attended a school that was built by the Rosenwald Fund on the grounds of an AME church. I went to a Rosenwald funded school in Southampton County, Virginia, and I'm not that old. That says a lot more about Virginia than it does about anything else, but we'll come back to that. When he and his sisters and brothers and sisters decided they wanted to get a library card and they went to the local library, they were denied because they were not white. But he still continues to read and tries to learn more. And as he did that, like Hamer, he began to question some of what he heard in church and to notice that the preachers were saying nothing he found relevant to the political and economic conditions of its members, not really speaking to the real needs of the people in the pews. He was able to supplement what he was reading and his lack of a more formal education by listening to the radio. So in 1955, he heard a sermon and a broadcast that he never forgot. It was Martin Luther King Jr. preaching a sermon in Montgomery. He says, I listened as this man spoke about how it wasn't enough for black people to be concerned only with getting to the promised land and the hereafter, about how it was not enough for people to be concerned with roads that are paved with gold and gates to the kingdom of God. He said we needed to be concerned with gates of schools that were closed to black people and the doors of stores that refused to hire or serve us. This man was talking about dealing with the problems people were facing in their lives right now, specifically black lives in the South. So this is later that same summer, so he hears Martin Luther King. Later that same summer, he also hears on the radio the sad news of Emmett Till's death. But it was this boycott and this sermon in Montgomery, he says, coupled with that, quote, changed my life more than any other event, more or since. That one radio sermon convinced Lewis that going into the ministry, an ambition he was already thinking about, was exactly the right course for him. And it was King's activism during the boycott that served as a model for the ministry that he hoped to engage and that he hoped other preachers would engage with in rural communities. Now, he wanted to go to Morehouse, as King had done, but his family, unlike King's, could not afford to send him there. But one day, his mother, who worked as a maid for a white Southern Baptist family, brought home a Baptist newspaper containing an ad for the American Baptist Theological Seminary in Nashville. And it said, "For colored," said the advertisement, and so Lewis applied. He considered it a blessing to be able to attend that school, which allowed its students to work to pay for their room and board. In fact, it was the only way he was going to be able to go to college. And like many black Christians, including Benjamin Mays and others, Lewis criticized white Southern Baptists for closing their doors to black people while claiming to adhere to Jesus' doctrine of brotherly love. So ironically, this seminary that trains him was funded by those white Southern Baptist Convention for the express purpose of training black Baptist preachers, and that seminary would later come under harsh criticism for instilling a kind of political conservatism in its students. They weren't trying to turn out John Lewis to become Martin Luther King Jr. They wanted to train a different kind of more subservient black male preacher. And yet Lewis's life, he went there, took what he needed, and used it in the way that he saw best. When he's in Nashville, as many of you know, Nashville also is the home of Fisk University and Meharry Medical School, both black institutions. So there are a large number of black students in Nashville at that time who were eager to challenge segregation. And he came to know them while he was in seminary. And he becomes, meets people who introduce him to teachings that broaden his understanding. He goes to a church there, a Baptist church headed by a political activist named Kelly Miller Smith, who was calling for a, quote, disciplined Negro Christian movement. And he would later become a founding member of the SCLC. Septima Clark, another brave black woman, was spearheading training sessions in civil rights and literacy at the Highlander School in New Market, Tennessee. That's where Fannie Lou Hamer and those were coming back before they got beat for going. Lewis then had what I would call a political conversion. He said, when they started to do sit-ins in Nashville in 1960, he saw it in religious terms. He said, now I had crossed over. I had stepped through the door into total unquestioning commitment. This wasn't about that moment or that day. This was about forever. It was like deliverance. I had, as they say in Christian circles, when a person accepts Jesus Christ in his heart, I had come home. But this was not Jesus alone I had come home to. It was the purity and the utter certainty of the nonviolent path. So he had become a convert to this movement that he was able to witness. He, of course, later becomes a part of the group of students who are trying to desegregate interstate buses, the so-called freedom rides. He was also brutally beat, violently attacked, imprisoned at Parchman Prison. But he once again turned to Christian examples, and he said, I really felt then, and I still feel, that we in SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, were a lot like members of the early Christian church, going out with virtually nothing but the clothes on our backs to bring the gospel of freedom to the people. And he credits SNCC's success to local women, wives and mothers in their 40s and 50s, resilient women, he says, naming Fannie Lou Hamer as one of his examples. So there's this generational coming together within the movement itself, and I think that's really important to remember as well. So in time, Lewis goes back to Nashville and goes back to Fisk, and he writes a really long paper on what he'd experienced in the civil rights movement, and it is his claim that the church, in a very real way, was the major and the essential gateway to that movement. He argued that the meaning of the church exists only outside of the church and not solely within the church. He says, this is what the church had come to mean to me. I felt the Spirit, the hand of the Lord, the power of the Bible, all of those things, but only when they flowed through the church and out into the streets. As long as God and his teachings were kept inside the walls of a sanctuary, as they were when I was young, the church meant next to nothing to me. In the case of the civil rights movement, though enough courageous ministers and congregations stepped forward to meet that need, but they remained a minority, and this is really important, for us to remember. Even in a place like Birmingham, activist preachers there were a minority. Andy Young at some point had written and said, of the more than 400 black churches in Birmingham, there were only 14 that agreed to host the mass meetings that were our primary means of communicating with blacks in Birmingham. So it's a small group of folks who are willing to brave the consequences that are going to flow from that. But for the commitment of that small new breed of clergy, he calls them, new breed of clergy, the movement's efforts in Birmingham would have been thwarted. The other person I want to talk to you about, and then I'll pull these together for us, is Marian Wright Edelman, who some of you may be familiar with, the longtime head of the Children's Defense Fund in Washington. She grew up in South Carolina and had very vivid memories of Benjamin Mays, among other people. Like him, she was born in South Carolina, not in the 19th century, but in 1939, on the cusp of World War II. She was raised in her father's Baptist parsonage. Her father was a preacher, and they named her when she was born Marian, only a few months after Marian Anderson sang here on the steps of the Lincoln. And that they wanted to, by naming her after Marian Anderson, they wanted to instill a particular kind of sense of self-worth and collective obligation in the children in their church and in their community. And they saw that and saw her and brought her up to understand that that's what she needed to do as part of the next generation. They made sure that she went out and heard black public figures like Mary McLeod Bethune and Benjamin Mays, her father would often drive them really long distances to take her to see them and to witness them. And that made a very strong impression on her. She remembers Mary McLeod Bethune, quote, seeming confident about who she was, proud of what she had achieved, and never ashamed of where she came from. She also had come from a rural background. The power of her forceful personality in the room, even one mostly full of men who listened very attentively to her as she spoke, that power never left me. Her parents welcomed Benjamin Mays and his wife into their home. And so when she finally went to Spelman on a scholarship, because her father had died, she then began to look to Benjamin Mays, who was president at Morehouse, as her father figure. She remembered him as being, quote, ramrod straight of posture, of unwavering principles, and caring, keenly intelligent, and elegant in speech. And it's Mays that she credits with inspiring her with a passion for excellence and service. So she's a college student in the late 1950s and 1960s. She's got all of this intellectual curiosity, but she's also got a really deep spiritual yearning, and she's religiously grounded. And she's trying to reconcile this sense of service and vocation and religion, and there are wider possibilities open to her than to Fannie Lou Hamer, than to her parents' generation. And so she's trying to figure that out. She wants to be engaged in some way. So in 1958, she's able to go abroad for a year from Spelman, thanks to a fellowship there. And I think it's that travel, she sees herself as part of a larger global community of other Black people. She's running into them as she's traveling. And it also made her even stronger, her desire to try to find some way to do some meaningful work. She read about the Montgomery bus boycott while she was overseas, and it struck a nerve in her. It made her both proud and angry, as if she said, a long suppressed rage bubbled up within me. And so when she goes back to Spelman in her senior year in the fall of 1959, she's searching for what she calls a call. She's searching for a call in the most religious terms that we know. Civil rights movement is bubbling up all around her. She always would say, had she been born a male, had she been born a man, the ministry would have drawn her. But that avenue was not open to her at that time. She was going to chapel services at both Spelman and Morehouse, but she stopped going to the churches in the community in Atlanta because they weren't politically engaged. Too many Black preachers, she said, acted as if the last pharaohs to get in the way of God's people lived in Egypt 3,000 years ago, and so she stopped going. So while she's at Spelman, she's joining her fellow students in Atlanta to do sit-ins against segregation in Atlanta. And those are the sit-ins that Nanny Burroughs is talking about in her deathbed to Benjamin Mays. They publish a newspaper ad. The student gets together enough money to publish a newspaper ad that explains what they're doing and why. They wrote, "We want to state clearly and unequivocally that we cannot tolerate in a nation professing democracy and among people professing Christianity the discriminatory conditions under which the Negro is living today." She goes to the founding meeting of the Student Nonviolent Committee, and against her family's wishes, she decided she wanted to go to law school. She wanted to go to law school and become a civil rights lawyer because she's inspired by the example of Howard University law professor Charles Houston and other Black lawyers who had done all of the work to make the Brown case in 1954, desegregating schools, to make all of that work possible. She saw that as a way to bring together her political commitments and her intellectual commitment. She talks about the first time she heard Martin Luther King Jr., and I think it's really important for us to remember not only how young King was when he was assassinated, but how young he was at the start of this movement, and yet the impact he had on people who were even younger than he was at the time. So it was the annual Founders Day speech at Spelman, and they had invited King in April 1960, and she says, from April 1960 until his assassination in April 1968, He was a continuous, personal, important presence in my life and in that of so many other young people. So this encounter with King, and I think also with King's message, and the fact that he was only 10 years older than they were, really inspired a whole generation of students to become involved. She liked his intellect, she liked his spiritual depth, and she liked his political commitment. All of that was brought together to her by King. She's writing in her diary as a student. She says he was great. There's something almost holy about him. There's something powerful and assured. He has found the meaning of life in God. I hope and pray by the time I'm 29, because she's 19, by the time I'm 29, I will have done half so much for people and the world. And that's to say that when people talk and when they preach, you never know who's listening and what they're going to take from it, and who you're touching and who you might be inspiring. And it was that speech that put her back firmly in touch with her own sense of God, and it reaffirmed her faith. And there was a way to be both religious and also be politically active, and she wanted to be both. As a young person, she's only 19, she's writing, "We are making history. We're taking upon ourselves the problems of the time, and what a good burden that is. Help us to be worthy of our great call." And she's 19, and I retired from teaching at Penn in the middle of the pandemic. One of the things I miss most is the group of people who are 18 to 22, that age group, because there's such hope and vitality and such energy there. And so to hear this 19-year-old or this 18-year-old sounding the way my students sound when they're excited about something really brought that back home to me. By the time she sees King again, she considers him to be, quote, almost Christ-like. And eventually she was to meet him. She was the one who was briefing him on what was going on in the Atlanta sit-ins, and she invited him to one of their student rallies, and he said, "I don't think I can get there." But when 1,000 students held a sit-in on the Capitol grounds, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. came out of nowhere, she says, and the place went wild. Time magazine then does a cover story on the Atlanta protests, and that becomes a really important part of the national attention to what's going on in the South. But she still wants to go to law school. So in 1960, she's one of 10 black women to enter Yale Law School. And she throws herself then into working in the North and to doing as much work as she can while she's still there. In 1963, at the March on Washington, she comes for that. As I earlier, it's her third year of law school. She also starts to work for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund in New York. But then in 1964, she goes to Mississippi. She's sent to basically to handle all those cases like John Lewis's that come from people who are being beat and put into jails at that time. She sees it, though, in religious terms. She says, God was headed south to Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia and Louisiana and North Carolina, and I went along for the scariest, most exhilarating, most challenging years any human being could hope for. She was to spend 4 years in Mississippi, and in all that time, she never saw another local female attorney, black or white. But she was there trying to use what she'd learned at Yale Law School to do some good in those areas. But it was in Mississippi where she says she was most impressed by the strength and resiliency of the human spirit and the ability of determined people to resist and overcome evil through personal and collective will. It was their religious faith she saw that empowered them, and this in turn inspired her. She later would write, "Never have I felt the company of such a great cloud of witnesses for divine and human justice, willing to risk life and limb and shelter," and that is literally the truth, risk life and limb and shelter so that their children could be free and better educated. And so she was especially grateful for Fannie Lou Hamer, who I talked about earlier, who was older, for, quote, her faithful practice of the hard message of Christianity, which kept us from hating when we really wanted to hate. though Hamer herself also continued to criticize black preachers who refused to support the movement. So after 1964, there are changes in the student movement itself. Student activists become more impatient with the lack of what they see as a lack of progress, and so she shifts her work in Mississippi to issues of hunger and early childhood education, and that's an effort that King supported and joined her in. And although she is always reluctant to take credit for it, it was her testimony in front of a Senate subcommittee investigating hunger that then would attract Robert Kennedy to the Mississippi Delta in 1964, adding even more visibility to the work on poverty and hunger that then became the genesis for the Poor People's Campaign, which lobbied for housing and food and jobs on behalf of poverty-stricken Americans of all races. That was the work that Martin King was engaged in at the very end of his life, and it's work that's been taken up under the same banner by Reverend Barber now. But that's the genesis of that in 1968. So they're planning for the Poor People's March on Washington, and a few days before his assassination in Memphis, King gives a sermon at the National Cathedral, and the sermon's titled, "Sleeping Through a Great Revolution." He emphasized there that human progress depends on, quote, the tireless efforts and the persistent work of dedicated individuals who are willing to be co-workers with God, co-workers with God. And so it's that speech for her, rather than the often quoted ones that we hear, like the one he gave the night before his death, or the one that she had heard on the mall in 1963. It is that speech that she most associates with King's death and life. And she then says, 4 days after his impassioned plea for America to help the poor, he was dead. And I think her account still evokes the trauma of that death and the anguish felt by the people within the movement, especially people as young as she is and as young as many of them were. She writes, "Our dark, deep despair at Dr. King's death was leavened only by the fact that we still had Robert Kennedy, who, if elected president, might not only end the war in Vietnam, but finish the needed war against poverty." And of course, as we know, those of my generation who lived through the traumas of the assassinations, 8 weeks later, Kennedy too would be assassinated in 1968. So if you're in the movement and the people you're looking to as leaders, and King and Kennedy were not the only ones, there's a litany of folks who were murdered in that movement. What do you do then? Where do you go then? And I think what we see in her example is that she decides that she has to continue to be engaged, and that's when she founds the Children's Defense Fund in Washington, which still today continues to advocate for federal and state legislation that will provide basic health, nutrition, and education needs for poor children, for all poor children. She based her work in Washington, D.C., but she still embraces a model of political presence at the national level, and we need that there too, and at the local level. But it's her commitment to the needs of the young that carries the commitments that she saw in Burroughs and Mays forward. And even those of you who she also set up a center in the Haley Farm in Tennessee, which is modeled on the Highlander School where she had gone to be trained to do civil rights work. So in that way, you see someone who's also trying to institutionalize the work to go forward, both at the Children's Defense Fund and in its outreach into religious communities. But like Hamer, and I think like Lewis, she gives primary credit, civil rights movement, to Black women activists. She says the movement might never have realized its enormous potential to transform Southern politics if Ella Baker and Septima Clark, who I had mentioned before, had not picked up where Mrs. Parks left off, where Rosa Parks left off. And there might have been no movement without the preaching in mass meetings and music like Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer singing "This Little Light of Mine, I'm Gonna Let It Shine." That's what held us together as a community of often ragged and often scared activists, giving us courage and spiritual nourishment. So she saw herself in that line from Hamer and others, a continuation of the central role of Black women, but also understanding, quote, if Black women had not done what they always do, most of the organizing and scut work, while men get most of the credit and publicity, our families and communities would not have held together through slavery and segregation. She says, women are the backbone of the Black church, without whom it would crumble. Now, John, and I'll end here. Now, John Lewis went another way, faced with all of what I just recounted in terms of witnessing all of the death and assassination violence. And we've seen him bloodied in Selma as it's preserved. But he also looked for a way to continue to do the work he felt called to do as a child in Alabama, but in a different realm, as a congressman from Georgia, where he served for so many years, and where he still continued to try to uplift people born into poverty as he had been, and to oppose unjust wars and injustices here and abroad, including the most basic of rights, the denial of the ballot, or denial of access to the ballot. Fannie Lou Hamer, which is where I began, and I'll conclude in this way, gave her life to the spirit of this long history that I've been taking us through today, surviving that brutal beating in the jail, surviving the triumph and the defeats of the 1964 Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City, where she famously and plaintively asked, "Is this America? Is this America?" Yet, unlike her younger cohort of college student activists, unlike Lewis and unlike Edelman, Hamer's later opportunities in life were limited by her race, by her age, by her gender, by her limited education, and her fervent commitment to remain in her native Mississippi, which is where she chose to stay to continue to fight injustice and poverty. When she died in 1977 at age 60, she was penniless, but was lauded at her home church, William Chapel Missionary Baptist Church in Mississippi, the place where she had attended that very first Mass meeting with which I began. It's the history of her life, and I think of her fellow activists named earlier, and the many people who are unnamed and whose names we will never know. To me, this is all linked to a movement of religious rebellion, people by a small but courageous minority, a remnant, as Burroughs would use the term, who had the faith and the power of a few to make changes that would affect us all. Now, as a historian, I am painfully aware of the living history which we witness in the 21st century, where we sit today. It's a period that began with a contested presidential election in 2000. Do you all remember that in Florida? The realignment of politics after the attacks of September 2001, and I would say of both religious and racial politics as a result of that attack. The surprise election of President Obama in 2008 and 2012, a moment that was awash in possibility and hope. The return in 2016 to an unvarnished politics of cruelty and greed and division and racism, a global pandemic in 2020 in the middle of all of that, an all too brief and partial reprieve in the election of 2020, a year marred once again by the murders of Black men and women at the hands of those who are paid by us to protect and defend. And now here we sit once again in a moment filled with despair and wanton evil and hatred and violence, sanctioned from the Oval Office up to Pennsylvania Avenue to the Capitol, across the street to the Supreme Court. But it was John Lewis who said that there is a spirit of history which served as the basis for his faith and his political worth. He said the self, even a sense of self, must be totally removed in order to allow this spirit in, to allow the spirit of history in. It is a process of giving one's giving over one's very being to whatever role history chooses for you. Now, I'll be long gone before this history is written, or at least written well, which requires the benefit of hindsight and distance. And from those who are living in this with us, especially our brothers and sisters and siblings who do not have the comforts and privileges that we know and share, and who are really still struggling for the basic necessities of survival. So the question is, what is it that we are to do as a religious people right now, sitting where we sit? How are we going to be religious rebels? In what ways are we going to go forward? How do we honor the legacies of folks I've talked about today, like Burroughs and Mays and Hamer and others, who rose up to meet the challenges of their day? So we have to find some way to bear witness, and we have to act, and Black churches like this one, thankfully, remain a place where we can gather and sing and sit and pray and preach, but we also, sitting in a place here that takes that power and that commitment outside the walls of this sanctuary, and in that way I see this church as a powerful testimony of religious rebellion and commitment, a remnant of a remnant, and I hope that the despair that's all around us will not drown us, and that we will find some way forward, overcome our fear and refuse to withdraw, try to stay engaged, talk to one another, and stay in community, and go wherever it is that God leads us and do what God leads us to do. So thank you. Oh, thank you, thank you. Thank you.
Dr. Savage, thank you so much for reminding us of how important it is to know our history as we try to determine what we do next, and to be reminded of our ancestors, what's in our DNA, that we are most capable. We have time for questions. Come on.
Good morning. Over here. Hi. My name is Jordan Toon. So my question, and I'll wrap it as best as I can. So currently we're obviously going through this time with the Trump administration, and we're attempting to, I guess, determine who our leaders are. You named a lot of great leaders, and in this generation it seems they look towards social media. The Conservative Party did very well at controlling social media for 4 years to assert their narrative. My question is, given that it seems like we can do our part in the small realms of organizations, but they're not as big as they were during the Civil Rights Movement. So my question is, who do you think we need to look to? I know people want to look at politicians, but they want them to be perfect, right? Kamala was demonized for 4 years until they realized that half the time they were lying, right? So who do we kind of look to now, if it's a politician, or who is it that we can attempt to look to so that we have those people that can bring people out, like John Lewis can bring people out, like Martin Luther King, like Fannie Lou Hamer, so we're ensuring that we control the proper narrative and people are voting in their best interests?
Thank you for that. It's a great question, which I am not going to answer, but I will offer up just a couple of, which is not to say that it's not answerable and that there isn't, and I don't mean to be glib about it. I think my reluctance is that who I look to may not be who you look to or who you want to look to. And it's not necessarily a question I have an answer for myself. I can say something about the people who I think are doing inspiring work right now. And Reverend Barber is one, but there are many, many others, and I really admire his work. And I also, because I am not technologically sophisticated, and at some point I made a decision that the real world was enough for me, so I didn't, enough as in trying to manage the real world. So the virtual world is one that I dip in and out of as I need to, but I'm not a proficient or even an expert on that. But I will say that you're absolutely right that the current media environment, and by that I don't just mean, old-fashioned stuff like radio and television, which are still very powerful, but the media environment where each one of us is connected to a little computer in our pockets and to a world that we're choosing for ourselves based on what we listen to and the algorithms that send us more of podcasts or wherever we think we're getting our information on Instagram and Facebook and all of that. And I saw a nice little piece by Brittany Cooper, who on Instagram just the other day, and she said, yeah, we're all on social media. And she tried to make a real important distinction between that we all feel like we want to be engaged and want to know what's going on. And she said there is a real difference between information and knowledge. That you can be, and this is Brittany Cooper, you can be inundated with information 24/7, all day, not all day long, but if you're not also engaged with people who are experts in some way, whether it's in religion or theology or the Bible, that you can get all this information and not have knowledge, and I thought, and certainly not have wisdom. So it's ironic that we're in this period where you can find out everything you want to know with a single simple Google, but in terms of the kind of depth of commitment that these people had when they were searching within their own souls to figure out how to survive the reality of violence, we still need to be grounded in something in the real world. And even though we can also constitute and be a part of virtual communities, and I think that's really, really important, although it's not, what I do, we also need real community too, with real people. And a community doesn't have to be 20 or 30 or 40 people. A community can be 4 or 5 people who you can say, I can't make it today. What's going on? I read this, and just some group of people who can hold you steady as you decide what it is that you can do, where you are. So I haven't answered your question. I hope that some people will, who know more than I do. But I think we're beginning to see the emergence of people who are ready to fight. I mean, I was very encouraged by the lawsuit that immediately challenged the trying to do away essentially with the 14th Amendment. I mean, they're really trying to do away with birthright citizenship. If they can do away with that, they can do away with everything else that's in the 14th Amendment. And to me, sadly, that those resources have to be put into that kind of fight. But I'm glad that people are willing and able and eager to do that. And we will see how people respond to the brutality and the ugliness that we're now seeing against people in our own communities, including immigrants and others.
Can't say enough as to how much I enjoyed your lecture. You have the right last name. Here's the question I have.
That didn't used to be a compliment, but then young people told me, it was about 3 years ago, yeah. So anyway, thank you.
I wouldn't know about that.
I don't either.
I'm too sanctified. But here's my point I'm making. As you were talking about Burroughs in particular, 2 women of faith and women of the non-faith world as well came to mind. I wonder if you could kind of weave them into it. Ida B. Wells and Zora Neale Hurston.
Oh my, Ida B. Wells actually, was she a Methodist? No, I made that up. Yes, she is Methodist. Yeah, okay. Ida B. Wells was just to kind of refresh us, she was trained as a journalist, actually, as many of you know, and also then went on to do much, but especially to fight against lynching of black men in the early 20th century, and was a fearless advocate in that way. But that work did not come out of the church, I do not believe, but it came from her basically gathering statistics and showing the fallacies of the reasons that people were saying that black men were being lynched. And so it was her skills as a journalist that really propelled her forward into the work that she was doing for the rest of her life. Zora Neale Hurston was an anthropologist by training, and then later a very famous writer, fiction and nonfiction, But one of the things that I found interesting about Hurston, which we forget about, is that she was one of the first anthropologists to go south and to study African-American religious forms there in the 1920s and 30s, including voodoo and other African-derived expressions. And she was also one of the first to actually go in and try to understand what's going on in a holiness and a Pentecostal church, what's happening with aesthetic worship. So I have written about her because even though she's an anthropologist and she's not herself deeply, well, she's an anthropologist, she goes as an observer, she is very respectful of the religious expressions that she finds in the rural South, and she feels the power of it, and she tries to capture that in her writing. So I have always seen her as someone really valuable for bringing that, for witnessing and preserving the evidence of those early religious lives and expressions in the 20s and 30s. And that part of her legacy is not emphasized enough. But to put Hurston and Ida B. Wells in conversation would be a difficult thing for me to do off the cuff. But you do raise up two really important and very strong and powerful women who lived out really interesting lives. Black women lived very interesting lives in the 20th century. And that's one of the things I've learned from thinking about biography and history, that you can have people, if you look at their whole lives, you can just see history marching through their lives, though in different ways. And even with whatever limited choices we think we have, people are making choices all along the way into how they want to try to, many of them, to help and to do some good.
That's great. Yeah, but that's
very much.
Yes,
point
we
point
know with
made.
great authority.
Presbyterian, Ida B. Wells. Okay, haven't thought about her in a while.
Wait. She was an attorney for the Methodists.
Wait. Oh, you mean AME?
Yes, her husband was AME and she was an attorney for the AME church.
Okay.
That may have been why you thought AME.
Okay.
Okay, 2 more questions and then we are out of time.
One of the things that I've noticed, observed, is that the relationship between the churches, the black churches in this country, and let's say similar churches in the Caribbean or Africa seems to be either thin, limited, purely philanthropic. And I'm wondering if you have examples of where there were partnerships among churches in the greater diaspora and what those partnerships may present to us in terms of opportunity for growth, empowerment, et cetera.
I don't have particular examples on hand, but there are examples to be had, and I can work to try to, maybe we should do like a little bibliography that you can post of, because you asked me another question I couldn't answer earlier. So, so maybe we can build on that. I do think that speaking of the AME church, one of the things that we see there in the 19th century is the establishment of AME churches all over Africa, starting in particular in South Africa and Sierra Leone and elsewhere. So there is always a global dimension to in the traditional black denominations, Baptists and Methodists in Africa and elsewhere. What happens in the Caribbean is a little bit trickier because of British imperialism, and so you have a lot of black Episcopalians in the Caribbean, and they are now part of my church in Philadelphia when they move here. So there's an Anglican communion that is led by the global white Episcopal Church that also is in the Caribbean. We shouldn't actually forget to think about the Catholic Church and its approach, as well. But that's a really good question about contemporary relationships and contemporary connections. It'll be really interesting to pull some of that together because we often only hear about the most conservative outreaches to black churches in Africa, and not coming from other black churches, but from very conservative white fundamentalist organizations globally and from the United States. whether including in Catholicism and among Episcopalians and others as well. So maybe we can pull something together on that. But it's a good question. I just don't have an answer.
Hi, Dr. Savage. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you.
And my question is very quick, Dr. Judy. I know that we talked a little bit earlier about the Black Lives Matter movement, and there was a sentiment that was made about young people that I just wanted to lean just a little bit more into as someone who work and have trained thousands of young people across the country in positions of political leadership, but just on the basic principles of community organizing. The greatest sentiment is that, working in spaces with adults is hard for them to have a voice, and we've seen that in the reason why Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was formed to give the young people a voice, and Ella Baker helped to do that. So the question is, can we talk more about the importance of young people's voice and leadership in the struggle for collective liberation?
I think it's an absolutely essential voice, as I was saying earlier about the spirit of the 18 to 22-year-old. But I do think that movements that can be really successful can also be intergenerational. And I think that's one of the things that we forget about churches. I know one of the reasons, when you grow up and you go through a period, well, I'll speak for myself, you go through a period where you're not in church for whatever reason, and then at some point, you have a yearning for a Black intergenerational space, outside of your family. So you can come into a Black church and there are going to be babies and children and people in their 80s and 90s. You're not going to get that at work. You're not going to get that you may get it in your fraternity and sorority, whatever. But I'm just saying that churches also are truly intergenerational spaces. And if there's going to be kind of a religiously inflected involvement in what needs to be done here, in some ways the church can model how you hold that together, how you hold together a youth ministry and also, do the work of the church. But I feel like as someone who, I have enough gray hair now that people help me get off and on the train. So, in all seriousness, I think every generation has to find its way, and every generation has to take up the mantle. And I think most successful movements, just like I've just recounted, these are very young people who are teenagers when they start in this movement or in their 20s. I mean, Martin Luther King dies at such a young age. And so that's the under 30 generation that was, that movement. And we forget that, I think, sometimes. So I don't have an answer, but I will say that I think whatever happens going forward, and it was the inspiration that I did see in the Black Lives Matter movement, that there was young people sitting somewhere who said, we got to do something, even if it starts out as a Twitter hashtag. And then, from Ferguson and Trayvon Martin and forward, they found a way to use those tools, to marshal. And in the summer of 2020, that was a beautiful outpouring in our streets, of not just young Black people, but it really touched folks. And I hope that we can reclaim and harness that spirit that we saw peacefully on the streets in 2020, rather than embracing what we saw on the Capitol grounds not so long after.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Barbara Savage one more time.
Thank you.
Dr. Savage, this was phenomenal, and it's always nice to be in the presence of a historian who remembers all those things that we take for granted. Thank you for reminding us of who we are. I want to thank you all for coming out to Seminary Saturdays, for your questions, for your enthusiasm, for the way that you have welcomed our guests. We are delighted that you were a part of this programming, and we hope to do it again soon. God bless.
Thank you.
Hey family, in the words of that gospel singer Montel Jordan, this is how we do it. It's Seek. You all know it, January 20th to February 28th. 40 days. We commit ourselves to a time of prayer and fasting, and it's right here, A Day in the Life, Seek Edition. It starts early in the morning. 4:30 comes awful early, and my commitment for 40 days is to lead our prayer time at 7 a.m. I want to make certain I'm refreshed, to have my private prayer and devotions, to read over the devotional guide for that day, get on the prayer line at about 6:55, 2,000, 3,000 people on the prayer line for 10 to 15 minutes of prayer. After that prayer, it's time to hit the gym. What's really important for me is to stay physically fit. Cannot do what God's called me to do if I'm not physically at my best. And after that workout is done and a little fatigue, it's time to feed the body. But because we're on the fast, can't go get bacon and eggs, can't have my pancakes, so I go to South Block, pick up my almond milk peanut banana smoothie. Yum. After that, probably time to go back home and start getting lunch ready, preparing the meal for the day. You gotta be certain that we're sticking to the Daniel fast. I'm gonna be fighting the desire to get on my phone and check out Instagram, to get on the TV and watch some basketball, all those things that distract, and whenever I wanna do those, get right back into the Bible. Gotta get to the office, because guess what? Sundays keep coming. Gotta prepare to preach the word of God. Gotta keep having meetings during Seek. And Seek is about learning to balance the things you have to do in life while still putting God in God's proper place. And we're gonna do it for 40 days. 40 days is a long journey. So my prayer is that when these 40 days are over, not only will we be better in our body and in our mind and rested in our spirit, but even more, stronger in our walk with God. This is a day in the life of Seek.
Hey everybody, it's Dr. Judy, your OTOG. And I am so excited because on February 4th, after a long time, we will resume in-person Bible study here in the sanctuary at the Alfred Street Baptist Church. We're beginning at 7 p.m. and we're going to study for about an hour. We're going to have an opportunity to examine God's Word and then have time for some Q&A. Those here in the audience will be able to ask directly, and if you're online, we hope we'll be able to take some of those questions online as well. I cannot think of a better time than now to resume Bible study as we enter into this season of Seek and have an opportunity to deeply explore and examine God's Word and God's will for our lives. Please join us on Tuesday, February 4th at 7 p.m.